Welcome back. Now that hopefully you have sort of a map, a pictorial map of the female hormonal cycle, we'll go through this PowerPoint and help maybe standardize your notes a little bit. So once again, the goals of the female hormonal cycle. If the female reproductive tract had a conscious goal, it would probably be this. The first goal would probably be to mature and release one ovum. Now, why is it important that only one egg wins the race to be egg of the month? Because the human female works best reproductively if there's only one pregnancy, one fetus at a time. Okay, we don't want to give birth to a litter. We're not talking puppies here. So if we pop out 3 eggs, well, we're talking triplets, etc., etc. So if we look at the hormonal controls, it's very neat how this is designed, the checks and balances to only mature and, more importantly, release one ovum. And the second goal is to prepare the inner lining of the uterus, which you know is the endometrium, for the implantation of a possible embryo. So there are the 2 goals, if you will, of the female hormonal cycle. All right, the first part of the female hormonal cycle is called the follicular phase. And again, I'm not saying first half because this part is highly variable in women. But as you can probably deduce, it's called the follicular phase because the main event here is that some follicles are maturing, and therefore the eggs inside them are maturing, and the follicles themselves are releasing estrogen. So how does this start off? The sex hormones are low. This is the stimulus, when the blood levels of sex hormones are low, and this we know is sensed by the hypothalamus. So the stimulus is the sex hormones in the blood, their levels are low. The response is, this should look really familiar, for the hypothalamus to release GnRH. GnRH goes through the little capillaries directly to the anterior pituitary. And because GnRH, remember it stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone, the anterior pituitary is going to release a gonadotropin, which is a hormone that affects the gonads. But unlike the male, during the first part of the woman's cycle, the anterior pituitary only releases FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So, the first part of the woman's cycle, the follicle stimulating hormone is circulating throughout the woman's body, circulating throughout her bloodstream, but the target cells are in the ovary. Specifically, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the woman's follicles, and it stimulates her follicle cells to do 2 things. One is to mitose, the other is to produce estrogen. So to repeat, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle cells of the ovaries to do 2 things. One is to mitose, 2 is to produce estrogen. And the estrogen helps the egg to mature. All right, and we're just going to review it one more time. The follicle cells are stimulated to mitose and to produce estrogen. Now estrogen, let's review what it does. It circulates throughout the woman's bloodstream. And a woman has estrogen receptors and cells all over her body. So let's review some of the effects. Estrogen promotes the development of a woman's secondary sex characteristics, which we've already reviewed. And it helps thicken the lining of her uterus called the endometrium. All right, another thing estrogen does is it actually stimulates the cervix to secrete a sperm-friendly mucus. Because what's going on here? Again, if the woman's reproductive tract could think, it really doesn't care about sperm. It doesn't really care if they're there or not, unless there's an egg that's about to be released. And that's what's going on here in the follicular phase. An ovum is maturing, several ova are maturing, and one is about to be released. So suddenly the woman's body compensates for this, and the cervix starts secreting a sperm-friendly mucus. It helps protect them from the naturally acidic environment in her vaginal region, and it also helps guide the sperm up through her reproductive tract. All right, as we've already gone over, as the number of follicle cells mitose, the numbers grow exponentially. So again, a characteristic of exponential growth. Where you had 1 cell mitosing, suddenly you have 2 cells mitosing, then 4, then 8, then 16, and you get this nice exponential growth when you look at the follicle cells. And when you have a huge follicle, that denotes a ripe ovum. And we've always so pointed out that because the follicle cells are secreting estrogen, as the number of follicle cells are growing exponentially, so are the woman's blood estrogen levels. And this is portrayed sort of nicely in your book's diagram. So in the follicular phase, the first part of the woman's cycle, you see a follicle increasing in size. And this diagram really does not give justice to the exponential growth. This mature follicle should be dramatically bigger than the immature follicle. But they do this nice. You can see this blood level of estrogen. As the follicle is small, you only have low blood levels of estrogen, and it just really surges up as the follicle becomes very mature. You might also want to know how the endometrium here, how it parallels the estrogen growth. As the estrogen level shoots up, the endometrium really thickens. All right, I like this diagram better. Here you see a much more dramatic increase from the size of mature follicle than the immature follicle. All right, so that's the end of the follicular phase. The whole part of the molecular phase is we have all these little follicles racing to be egg of the month. And at the end of the follicular phase, we have one follicle that is huge, denoting that there is a ripe egg inside. So once again, at the end of the follicular phase, one follicle is just huge, and that denotes there's a ripe ovum. But once again, a woman's brain cannot just look down at her ovaries and say, oh, look, that follicle is just swelling up really big like a balloon. It's about ready to burst. No, a woman's brain cannot look down and sense this directly. However, we have amazing regulation. The huge follicle produces this peak level of estrogen, which clearly the woman's hypothalamus can sense this. So what happens? The peak level of estrogen does two things simultaneously. One, it turns off the hypothalamus. It exerts negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Now, why is that so important to exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus? Because we want it to quit stimulating the anterior pituitary and so the anterior pituitary quits releasing FSH. We don't want to stimulate any more follicles. We don't want a second, third, and fourth place winner. We have one winner. That's the egg of the month. No more ova, no more babies. Right? So we turn off the hypothalamus, and simultaneously, this peak level of estrogen exerts positive feedback on the anterior pituitary, so that the anterior pituitary releases. Yep, I got that right. So it releases. Here we go. The huge surge of LH. So peak level of estrogen turns on the anterior pituitary. And remember, the bigger the stimulus, the bigger the response. So when the anterior pituitary is stimulated, since it's such a big stimulus, it releases this huge, huge surge of LH. And it is very, very, very well documented that this LH surge directly triggers ovulation. Boom, boom. This shows this very clearly. So note this LH surge here, and this dotted line represents the timing of ovulation. So you can see that that huge surge of LH immediately precedes ovulation. It does not matter if a woman ovulates on day 14 or day 10 or day 20 or day 17. The LH surge is what directly causes ovulation. Boom, there's a surge of LH. Boom, it pounds on the follicle. That hormone literally pounds on that ripe follicle, causes it to pop open and release the ovum. And again, what immediately precedes the LH surge? This peak level of estrogen is telling the woman's body there's a follicle that is ready to burst. So this peak level of estrogen turns on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases this LH surge, which is the direct cause of ovulation. And again, this is very finely controlled by the woman's hormonal system. And this timing is always boom, 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 no matter when she ovulates. All right, so here we have a summary again. We have the mature follicle, we have ovulation, the egg popping out of the follicle. And then what happens, this follicle, it fills in by mitosis. The woman's body is a great recycler. And as this empty follicle now fills in, it becomes a new endocrine gland called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum, as we've gone over, releases the other female sex hormone, progesterone. So the first part of the woman's monthly hormonal cycle is dominated by the sex hormone estrogen, as the follicle is maturing and releasing estrogen. And then the second half of her cycle is dominated by the female sex hormone progesterone. So we've gone over that the woman's ovary secretes both estrogen and progesterone, but it's not equal amounts during all parts of her monthly hormonal cycle. So after ovulation, this phase is appropriately called the luteal phase because it's dominated by the presence of the corpus luteum in one of the woman's ovaries. So to review what I just said, the empty follicle fills in by mitosis, becomes a new endocrine gland. Women are great recyclers. Corpus luteum literally means yellow body. You might know that a dead body is a corpse, and if you took Latin, you might know that this means luteum. Yellow means luteum, or vice versa, at least so I'm told. I never took Latin. And the corpus luteum secretes the female sex hormone progesterone. All right. Progesterone, as we know, is secreted into the bloodstream. It circulates throughout the bloodstream. There are also receptors for progesterone all throughout the woman's body. It promotes the development of it continues to promote the development of the female sex hormone or female sex characteristics. So once a woman hits puberty, she retains her secondary sex characteristics. Progesterone really thickens the endometrium. And it continues to exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus. Why? So if we look back up at that diagram I had before, remember estrogen levels started off low when the follicles were small. When you had a huge follicle, you had a peak level of estrogen. Well, notice the corpus luteum, it starts off relatively large. So the progesterone, as soon as it's secreted, it's naturally secreted in high levels, high enough to continue to exert negative feedback on the hypothalamus. And this is very important because we've just popped out one egg. We might get a pregnancy. So we don't want to mature any more eggs until we see whether this egg is going to be fertilized or not. So the second half of the woman's cycle is sort of wait and see. Will she become pregnant? Will she not? Will she become pregnant? Will she not? There's two possible endings for this story. Which one would you choose? Which one should we do? Most of my female students usually say, let's go with that not pregnant ending. So we'll explore this ending first. If the egg is not fertilized, if there's no developing embryo, the corpus luteum is genetically pre-programmed to die after 14 days. When the corpus luteum dies, it stops making progesterone. So the woman's blood progesterone levels are going to drop. Her estrogen levels have already dropped, right? There's no more mature follicle. That means her blood sex hormones are low. When her blood sex hormone levels are low, two things happen. Well, first of all, there's no sex hormone supporting the endometrium, so the endometrium sloughs off. And thus, menses begins. She has her menstrual flow. And second of all, the hypothalamus senses low levels of sex hormones and, well, you know the rest of the story. Here we go again. Hope you enjoyed this, and next class we'll investigate ending 2. What happens if the woman gets pregnant? We'll see you then.